As we have been covering all morning long, let's take a look at Vatican City right now, where crowds have gathered after the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88 early this morning in Rome after a long illness and a path-breaking papacy. And we want to go straight to Terry Moran for a look back at the life and legacy of Pope Francis.
Habemus Papam.
When this soft-spoken man emerged onto the balcony at St. Peter's with a humble bow to the faithful and praying the Our Father,
Buonasera.
few expected a pope who would so radically transform the face of the papacy and the spirit of Catholics around the world. The first Latin American pope, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, he grew up in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The son of an Italian immigrant, despite an early setback as a teenager, an infection that claimed part of his lung, this was a young man full of life, with a passion for philosophy, wine, and dancing the tango. But ultimately, Bergoglio couldn't resist the call from above, becoming a priest at 32, rising through the church hierarchy while shunning its trappings. As a cardinal, he sold off the church mansion, cooked his own meals, and rode the subway while helping the poor. So it only seemed fitting that the new pope would take his name from St. Francis of Assisi, who dedicated his life to caring for the poor. Catholics now also had their first Jesuit pope, an order of priests devoted to service for the greater glory of God. Gone were the fancy robes and designer shoes. This pope carried his own bags, paid his own bills, and drove a beat-up car. He chose a modest guest house over the lavish papal apartment. And Pope Francis brought change from the start, alienating some Catholics but inspiring more.
Before creating the world,
Dios amaba.
God loved.
Porque Dios es amor.
Because God is love.
Instead of washing the feet of fellow priests on Holy Thursday in an ancient ritual, Francis chose juvenile prisoners, women, and Muslims. When ordinary Catholics wrote him letters of despair, he telephoned them personally. And this pope was determined to reach out, often wading into the crowds without the bulletproof Pope-mobile, a headache for the Vatican security, but a breath of fresh air for the faithful. His extraordinary connection glimpsed during scenes like this. In Rio de Janeiro, a rock star welcome. Millions flocking to Mass on Copacabana Beach. This thoroughly modern pope, with a penchant for social media and selfies, did his best to publicly downplay the hero worship famously parodied in images like this one. Still, there was no denying this pope was different. For many Catholics, the message was long overdue. Shift focus from the hot-button issues like abortion, gay marriage, contraception, towards a less judgmental, more inclusive church. This seismic shift in tone, however, brought no change in doctrine. Francis called for a larger role for women in the church. At the same time, he reaffirmed church opposition to women priests. Francis wasn't leading a revolution, but he was bringing reform, speaking out against greed, rooting out corruption at the Vatican Bank. When Germany's so-called Bishop of Bling was exposed for his extravagant home renovations, Francis fired him. He took on the mafia in their own backyard, telling them they had excommunicated themselves from the church. And Francis would tackle some of the thornier problems, too. He made incremental steps to express compassion for the LGBTQ community while holding fast to the church's strict teachings. In a stunning declaration, Pope Francis said that laws criminalizing homosexuality are, quote, unjust.
Somos todos hijos de Dios.
We are all children of God, he said, and God loves us as we are and for the strength that each one of us has to fight for our dignity. Being homosexual is not a crime. It's not a crime, yes, but it's a sin. But first, let's distinguish sin from crime. But it is also a sin to lack charity with one another. And Francis went on to suggest that being gay is natural, a view unimaginable from any previous pope. Every man and woman must have a window in their life where they can turn their hope and where they can see the dignity of God, Francis said. And being homosexual isn't a crime, It's a human
Es
condition.
una condición humana.
Pope Francis would go on to permit priests to bless same-sex couples in a new papal rule, a seismic change in Vatican policy. At the Vatican, he met privately with victims of sex abuse by the clergy. He angered Jews on his trip to the Holy Land by adding a visit to Israel's barrier wall, a gesture of solidarity with Palestinians. Francis reinforced a message of church unity when he canonized the more liberal Pope John XXIII along with the more conservative Pope John Paul II. And joining him at the altar, his predecessor, former Pope Benedict XVI. Nearly 1 million Catholics crowded St. Peter's Square in jubilation. But for all the papal pageantry, Francis will be remembered most for his disarming humility and humor, his warmth with children, his compassion for the poor and the sick.
I would ask each of you, whatever your capacity, to care one another. Be close to one another. Respect one another. I bless each one of you from my heart.
Thanks to Terry Moran for that, as we were looking at the scene in Vatican City this morning after the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, John Carl. And John, Pope Francis, a simple man, in many ways a shy man, but he did not shy away from social, political, geopolitical controversies.
He sure did, and George. You know, he took the name Francis from the patron saint of the Pope, of the poor, and we think of him as declining to live in the palatial apartment that popes usually live in right off on St. Peter's Square, to take a small 2-bedroom apartment with other priests. We think of him washing the feet of juvenile prisoners, a humble man in so many ways, foregoing the big Pope mobile, driving going around in a much smaller vehicle. But he had a real impact on the world and did not shy from controversy on the issue of immigration and refugees. He was especially outspoken and tangled quite directly with the United States, with Donald Trump. I mean, as recently as February of this year, he sent an open letter to cardinals that was quite critical of the idea of mass deportation, and talked about Christianity being the need for Christians to care for the poor and for the unfortunate. That letter, very moving words, said, "What is built on the basis of force and not on the truth about the equal dignity of every human being begins badly and will end badly." In an interview on Italian television, just as Donald Trump was about to be inaugurated, he was asked about the plans for mass deportation, and he said, "If true, it will be a disgrace." And not just the issue of immigration, and not just Donald Trump. He went in February of this year also to the Russian embassy in Vatican City, and directly appealed to the Russian ambassador to end the war in Ukraine, to end the killing in Ukraine. And on climate change, George, he issued an encyclical that was very forceful about the need for Christians to take on the issue of climate change and the need to deal with the challenges of fossil fuels in our environment, and to combat what he saw as a threat to humanity.